The question we're looking at today really is, are professional sports people, and I guess particularly footballers, actually public figures, as well as being athletes? Are they also public figures, and therefore open to all kinds of off-field reporting of their activities, their drug use, their brawls, their criminal associations, their love affairs, their gambling, their mental issues, car accidents? Are they all fair game for the media? Because if they weren't footballers, no one would give two hoots, really. It's just, if you're a citizen, that's not going to be reported. And thinking about this, a couple of weeks ago, the Sunday Herald Sun decided that the very best story of the day, or possibly the one that would sell most papers, was a front page story of Kelly Stevens with a flash headline, with a splash headline, "Wayne loved me." And this was in response to something Anthony Stevens said earlier that week. Inside, a double page spread of words, texts such as "the honey blonde wag turned wellness rock chick has been silent for 13 years. This isn't a kiss and tell, this is a kiss and yell." And it was under a headline, "Thrown to the Wolves." And while it referred to Kelly being thrown to the wolves by other people, I thought it was being thrown to the media pack, the wolves being the media. Terry Wallace is a multiple premiership and All-Australian footballer, an innovative coach of two AFL teams, the Bulldogs and Richmond, amassed 250 games and almost as many as a coach. Now a sports commentator, runs Sports Day and also currently the intricacies of the trade period under Trade Radio. Next to him, Matt Pinkney is sitting atop a vast AFL empire, media empire that includes digital, print products, afl.com.au, all kinds of apps, the record, social media, with a background as a print journalist, and now employs how many journalists? About 100 or so?
No, I'm glad you asked that. It's not 117, as everyone says. It's,
let's get the record straight.
It's 35.
Straight.
And the
35?
Rest, the rest of AFL media, they do other things.
Okay, thanks for putting us straight on that, Matt. Okay, Natalie Hickey is a barrister who specialises in contract, intellectual property, trademarks, and in sport. Her clients include people involved in sponsorship disputes, contractual issues, and social media issues. She runs a fantastic website called The Social Litigator, where she actually analyses branding, I guess, particularly by sports people such as Gerard Heenan, Matt Fife more recently, and how they kind of go about protecting their reputation and their commercial brands, I suppose. And finally, Tom Heenan is an enigma, really. He's a very interesting gentleman. He's a colleague from Monash University. He teaches sport and Australian society, a world of sport, Australian sports writing. He specialises beyond that, also writing scholarly biographies, including one of Wilfred Burchett recently, and with his colleague David Dunstan is writing a book, I believe, on Sir Donald Bradman. Okay, so I guess I'll just open up with a general kind of question. I mean, what level of privacy are footballers entitled to? And maybe we'll just have a few comments from each of you, and then we'll move on. Terry.
Well, I'll kick it off. Thanks very much for coming along today. I suppose where I sit as someone who's been in that industry as an AFL player an AFL coach over a period of time, we understand that the media is a major part of our industry. In fact, in some ways, our image helps us and it makes us more wealthy from being a part of the media industry as such, or running in conjunction with it. So we understand that some of our earnings come from our image, and our image is created by the media. So we understand that is absolutely 100% the case. We're public profile figures, there's no doubt about that. Whether we're all role models is another question that can be answered at another time, but certainly we are public profile figures, but with that, somewhere along the line there has to be boundaries of what is private and what's not private, in my opinion. I'll take it to the stage where when a father doesn't believe that he can attend his own 10-year-old's birthday party because it's in a public area and he's being filmed, photographed and analysed, I just think that there's a tipping point somewhere of what is reasonable and what becomes private and unreasonable. And that's, I think, the thing that we're here today to find out where that tipping point actually sits.
Absolutely. Matt, so AFL.com, I guess, is a bit of an outlier in a way because of its structure. While it's journalistic in, well, most ways, all ways really, it is owned by the AFL. So do your publications actually look at the kind of private off-field activities as other media do?
Yeah, so we were set up with the intent to compete with other media. So the AFL saw that there was an enormous amount of value that sat with the game and the media coverage of the game, and it felt that it should move into that area to extract some of that value to bring it back into the game. So when we were set up with the express intent of competing with other media for that public attention. So what we did was create a newsroom which, to all intents and purposes, is very similar to other newsrooms, and to that extent we have the same debates about privacy and intrusion as these other mastheads do. But when I was thinking about this and the question of where the line should be drawn, I think the answer is that no one actually knows, because a couple of weeks ago I was at an award presentation for one of our photographers who took a photograph of Mitch Clark, who was in the midst of depression, being comforted by his coach in the bowels of the MCG, and probably a lot of you have seen that photograph. When we originally published that photograph, there was a fair bit of talk that was an intrusion on his privacy, and particularly since he's suffering from a mental disease, that was a terrible thing. In fact, the tide turned on that debate, and people began to say that this is an example that even the strongest and the mightiest can be subject to these things. And the photographer who took that photo won this major award. So it's now held up as this great piece of public service, whereas if the debate had just turned a little bit, we would have been guilty of a gross breach of his privacy. So there's a few examples like that, and we can discuss them later on because I get them every day. But the summary, I suppose, is that we have to make individual judgments about context and damage, and a lot of it depends on the sort of response that you're getting from the subject as well.
Okay. Natalie, going back to the original question, so what level of privacy are these players entitled to?
Well, Bill, I tend to start, and my sort of website indicates where I'm coming from, which is that the law tries to inform the way I think about these sorts of things, but of course the law changes over time as well. So one of the questions that people often ask is, first of all, what is private and what is public? We've sort of even started this discussion without really kind of interrogating what that means. And judges don't know the answer to that, so there's no clear answer, but someone like Murray Gleeson, former Chief Justice of the High Court, Eric Banner's father-in-law, so he says, I used to think that a telephone call between people was a private occasion, but now if you walk down the street and everyone's on the mobile phone and you can hear in the tram, you know, who people are talking to, that's changed. When we talk about sports people, back in the day, there was a famous case concerning a woman called Samantha Hickey, no relation to me, who said, I've had an affair with Greg Chappell. He was captain of the Australian cricket team, and she wanted to tell her story on a current affair. Anyway, Greg Chappell went and got an injunction. We will never know what Samantha Hickey was going to say, because the court said that's failed the public interest test under defamation law. If you're going to say something defamatory, it's got to be true and it's got to be in the public interest. And the judge said, sleazy gutter journalism, I'm not here to protect that. This has nothing to do with his role as a sportsman. And so, and I want to make sure that people want to become public figures. So no, that was just public curiosity, not genuine public interest. Now, that's been ditched, that requirement of public interest under the law. So it's open slather. We turn to questions, for example, of Lara Bingle, the shower photo with Lara Bingle that Brendan Favola apparently took and then shared with a number of AFL mates. Now, she was terribly upset about that. She sued because I think we would all agree, and one judge said in another case, if you take a photo of someone in their underpants in the shower, then that's clearly private occasion. Well, here she was nude. But then what did she do? She commenced proceedings, and then 2 days later, it was discovered that she'd sold her story about how she felt for $200,000 to the very same magazine, Woman's Day, that had published the photographs in the first place. I think we know what the public reaction to that was, and she ditched the case. So she didn't understand what the boundaries were between public and private.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, I think the phrase public interest is really interesting. If it's in the public interest, it should be out there. If AFL players are connected to organised crime figures, it should be out there. If they're in the back room of some nightclub snorting coke, that connects to a criminal network that can be traced back to the jungles of Colombia, it should be out there. So the aspect of the public interest needs to be examined. The other thing is, in talking shower scenes, I think the most famous shower scene probably in the last 50 years in Australia was Shane Warne's, when he took his selfie in the shower and posted it on wherever. It went, as they say, viral. It's the most famous shower scene since Psycho, I'm sure. But it's out there. And Warne deliberately does this. He's lying in bed one morning, as you do. He's got the silk sheets. He looks up at the ceiling, the mirrored ceiling, and immediately, selfie. Straight on to his mates, 600,000 of them, and we're off. He's dating a woman, or he's thrown over a woman. The first thing he does is gets on to the Facebook followers and says, or the Twitter followers and says, who shall I date now? This is a manufactured private life. Warne is actually brilliant at it. And in that, on his Twitter page, on Bard actually, he places products. It's absolute sheer genius. But Shane Warne, the person, I think is quite different to the public character or the persona he presents on social media. And this is just not recognised by the public. We are now manufacturing private lives because of social media.
Okay,
Can I interject?
Yes, go ahead.
That manufacturing of private lives has been going on for way before social media. I mean, the classic example is to think about Hollywood celebrities and what their real names are. So Kirk Douglas, whose real name is Issa, lengthy Jewish name, he tells the story of how when his mother was dying and he's at her bedside in hospital and what it felt like to have women and nurses taking photographs of him. And in his autobiography, he wrote, but I at that point was Issa, I was not Kirk, and yet they were treating me in a particular way. But your point's completely right, because he self-selected that persona of who he wanted to be, And therefore, I think you could realistically say that you then have the torn reputation inside yourself, but you did ask for it.
So the question for me as a publisher is whether there's consent involved. So obviously Shane Warne consents to have these images of himself so-called private out there because it's a marketing exercise.
Yes.
Where it becomes a really thorny issue is when consent isn't involved. And we had an instance after the grand final where Adam Simpson was sitting in the coaches' room where they debrief the players after a game, completely alone with his hands in his head and a beer sitting at his foot. And Channel 7 had put a camera in there and had told the club that cameras would be in that room for, capturing vision. And they ran that vision, and West Coast and I think the AFL and Adam Simpson himself all exploded with outrage and said that was a private moment, that was not to be broadcast. And we've had it from down high that footage is not to be shown anywhere. So the consent issue is a huge part of it, and that's where you get these really difficult decisions that you have to make.
And that's one point that I'd like to get across. I understand where if somebody's doing an illegal activity, that is perhaps of interest to the general public. Understand the circumstances behind a couple of things that you mentioned. But where is the line crossed? I mean, I had a player that I was coaching by the name of Graham Polak who got hit by a tram. The trauma that was done to him at the time was incredible. He had somebody knock on his front door. So he's at home trying to get over these absolute traumatic injuries, and had somebody knock on his door, a media person knock on his door and say that they were representing the club, that they had got consent from the club to come to there, go to his private home, and then started questioning him about what his life was going to be like. He was, at that stage, an absolute mess. What was his life like going to be like? Would there be any football in his life after that particular incident? This was something to me that stepped across the line of what was fair and reasonable. He wasn't in a position, health-wise, to be able to make the correct decisions at that point. So I understand if somebody's out in the general public doing something wrong, that the media has every single right to be identifying that and outing that person. But when somebody hasn't done anything wrong and they're just trying to get over and recover from something, I think, to me, that's stepping across what I would call a line. Another one from my point of view, when I was coming towards the end of my coaching career at Richmond, I had basically media out the front of my house for probably the last 10 days of my coaching appointment, 24/7, so you could open the curtains at 4 o'clock in the morning and they were just sleeping in cars waiting for the first grab in the morning. Very similar to what happened to James Hird, but he had it happen for about 18 months rather than a week and a half. So I'm sitting there. One day I'm going to get a coffee with my wife. The media have sort of seen my family coming in and out of the family home. They wait until they see me drive out the door with my wife to go down the street, and then they go to the front door and knock and start questioning my kids, who at that stage are primary school to very, very low high school age, about whether their father's going to have a job within the next couple of weeks, how they're feeling about the trauma that they're getting at school. To me, that's crossing what I would think is a reasonable line.
Can I just ask you, did you, either about Graham Polak or these other incidents, actually complain to the media, and what kind of response did you get?
Complain on both in both circumstances, and I had actually worked with the media outlet in my own situation, and the other one was someone that I'd never really dealt with before. Both circumstances, they believed they were in their rights and hadn't crossed that imaginary line.
They would say that.
Yeah, and so therefore we really never got any great outcome from it. The Graham Polak situation, the story was pulled, so that we got that outcome from it. The other one, there was no outcome at all that was published, what my children had said. So fortunately enough, we'd trained them up enough to sort of straight bat most things.
So there's a subtlety involved in a lot of these issues. So I think what happened to you, Terry, was obviously horrendous, and we would never support that sort of activity. But what do we do in the instance of Buddy Franklin, who has come out and voluntarily, not admitted, said that he has a mental illness, but won't say what the mental illness is. So everyone assumes that it's depression, but we're not going to find out. So we and the industry actually know what the condition is, but we're under very heavy obligation or pressure, if you like, not to say what that condition is. So you've got a partial consent to what might be seen as an invasion of privacy, and then the person involved has drawn the line at a particular detail that you can go no further on. So, I mean, is that standard practice, or what?
Well, the lawyer in me, even though the clock's off, will tell you that if you actually sought to publish that, I think it would be very difficult for him to sue you. The reason for that is because Australia doesn't have a right to privacy law per se, and in fact, the way it works is that we've got to cobble together, a series of laws. So, for example, defamation. So I tick them off in my head, and I kind of go defamation. Well, okay, revealing. We already know that he has a mental illness. So much has changed about the way we regard it. I would be saying I don't think it's necessarily either defamatory or potentially, depending on what it is, maybe that affects things. I don't know, but I would have thought the context and the way in the story presented would not lessen people's estimation. I had a matter where I did represent Brad Pitt years ago in relation to the publication of nude photographs of him in Clio magazine, where they used to have the centrefold, and he wanted to sue in Australia for defamation. But they were so clever the way they did it, because of course they did it. We applaud, Brad's sensational body, and so there was no negativity, guys. It was fantastic. So we had to say, I'm sorry, and we don't have a tort of a right to privacy. Breach of confidence. I mean, that was one possibility. Another time acting for Brad. This time he was dating Gwyneth Paltrow, and they were at St Bart's and they were frolicking around in the nude, and he was pretending to be Hannibal Lecter, and anyway, you're the one that spit into appendages, but he had a certain thing tucked away when photos were published. Now, we were more successful in being able to say in relation to that was kind of a breach of confidence type situation, which is a different type of claim, because we have matters here which, in his case, it was lens outside, place in St Bart's. Thinks it's very much a private occasion. It's getting very close to trespass. How do we apply that here? I mean, in some ways, there's been this partial disclosure. If you go that next step, can you really say that you're breaching someone's confidence? I would say it would be a very difficult case to run.
Which is a nice segue into something Tom asked me to refer to, and that was something about the history of the penis in AFL.
Well, I think the penis has played a very important part in world history. We wouldn't be here if it hadn't. But you look at the penis in the AFL, there's a number of sex scandals in the AFL that, that jump off the page at you. And I'd suggest that delving into these sex scandals actually changed the AFL's view on women. It actually began to acknowledge them. We don't have, as John Elliott once said, the days of the Carlton Football Club paid off women who'd been sexually assaulted, so the story didn't get out. But there have been, cases such as Eustace. You had the Milne case that was thrown out of court. You've had Dane Beans, the book by Anna Krian on that case. There's been a history of it. And by delving into these cases, by delving into the private lives of these people, it actually helped to change things. It's not so much like the salacious media that emerged in Britain after the Profumo scandal in the early 60s. And with Murdoch's buying of newspapers in Britain and America, and the New York Post, for example, which ran the headline, "Headless Corpse in Topless Bar." But it does get to the point that delving into a private life can actually change things. And an instance of this is Sir Donald Bradman. Bradman masked his private life so much that he actually hoodwinked 17 biographers. When you dig deep into Bradman's private life and you look at things like the sectarian history and Bradman hated Catholics, Bradman's great-grandfather was an Italian Catholic who had 28 children. This is not mentioned in any Bradman biography. And if any biographer's doing their bloody job, it should be. But this is where private lives come in and undo mythologies. Once John Howard said about Bradman that he was the greatest living Australian, the gloves are off on his life. You go in and delve and ask, why is this life so protected? And you do dig back and you find a history of illegitimate births that the family have covered up.
Okay, so I just want to come back to something that Matt said about Buddy Franklin, and he declared a mental illness without going into the specifics of what it is. I think everyone wants to know what it is, So how come the media kind of decide, well, we're not going to report it? It seems that the independence of the media, in some regard, is in question here.
Yeah, I'd like to think that in most instances people hold back from revealing those further details out of respect for the person involved or respect for the principle of privacy. But I don't think the way that the media operates at the moment, that is generally the case. What happens is you've got this promise of mutual destruction, that if we go ahead and publish that all hell is going to come down on our heads from, in my instance, if that happened, it would be my bosses at the AFL, because they have a very different view of the media than I do. The Swans would hold out the threat of, we will never deal with you again, and if you want to interview Josh Kennedy, forget it, because you publish that story, we're not going to talk to you. So there's this sort of mutually assured destruction promised over these things. And, when someone is very powerful, like Buddy Franklin is, there's a lot of things that come with that which can damage someone who reports the wrong way about him. The sad issue is that when you've got someone like Kim Duthie, who's just a young schoolgirl, her privacy can be trashed, because there's nothing really that's going to come back the other way if you do it, other than a couple of criticisms, in the Fairfax media by a columnist on the opinion page. So it's not an ideal situation, and it's a slightly depressing one, I suppose.
So
are we putting are some areas of the media putting pressure on young employees? You either get that story or don't come back. Are you seeing that?
When I was a cadet on the old Herald, which a lot of people probably don't remember, but we used to do these things called death knocks. So people would die in a car accident or some sort of tragedy, and a reporter, generally a young one, would be sent out to the home of the person's relatives to knock on the door and get the story. And some reporters love doing that, and I absolutely hated it. And so I would go out there and I'd be tremulous, and I'd knock on the door very lightly, and if they answered, I'd say, look, tell me to go away, I don't want to be here, I'm sorry. Generally what happened was that people, because they saw that, they would invite me in and they'd show me the photos.
Good tactic.
And so I got this reputation as someone who was really good at death knocks, and it was the thing that I hated most. And thank God Eric Beecher came and took over and said no more death knocks. But to answer your question, there is a real pressure on young journalists to get that sort of story out.
I've seen a few that have left the industry and gone and worked in other areas of media. A couple that come to mind straight away that have changed from network television to going working with the clubs in a media capacity, because they just haven't been able to handle the pressures that have come with the situation. Now, one thing I don't want to be is I don't want to be the Grinch of everything that is media. I mean, I ended up working in the media myself. As I said from the outset, from a financial point of view, the media drives the television rights, and the television rights drives the wages of the AFL industry. So you can't be a Grinch about it, but that's where I was just sort of saying sometimes there needs to be a line drawn. I ask you guys, Ben Cousins, I coached Ben. Regardless of circumstance, is this right or isn't it right? And I don't know the answer. Ben Cousins is in his private home one evening on a Sunday evening. He has an episode within his house. He calls 000. An ambulance arrives, and before the ambulance gets to the hospital, the media are already at the hospital.
Yep.
Fair or foul?
Foul. In April this year, wasn't Cousins, the police were tracking him. The policeman was the boyfriend of a journalist and told the journalist. The other thing about Cousins, and I'm on Cousins' side because I think he was an outstanding footballer, one of the bravest, because he just ran. So I'm just a Cousins nut. But where do you say that somebody who has an addictive illness is a criminal? Where do you say somebody who has an addictive illness brings the game into disrepute? No, this man is sick, and it's not acknowledged. And I think the media really does have a duty of care in this to actually say at times that Cousins is ill.
So again, the subtlety in that one is the fact that Jason Ackermanis famously said that he played on Michael Braun one season, and Braun had this spotty complexion and was like a dray horse, couldn't run. Next season he played against him, he had this perfect complexion, he looked like a Greek god, and he ran all day. So if your drug taking and your addictive personality leads you into performance enhancing drugs, then that is an issue that needs to be dealt with.
And the other thing about that is, what was Cousins on? The actions of Cousins after a grand final victory, when Worsfold called him up, and he started swinging around his arms and things like that, that suggested a lot more that the Cousins was actually on something. But then again, was this because of an illness? Or was this because of he took that to perform?
So in terms of the media, I'm just trying to find out what the difference is with the media's attitude to Buddy and Ben. And so they'll do, they'll go to the hospital, but would they do that with Buddy? I mean, what is, maybe Matt or anyone who wants really, what is the key difference here? In terms of the media's reporting?
I think probably if you strip it back, what Ben Cousins was doing was actually allowing him to play the game better. Buddy's situation is nothing like that. So there's and maybe it's the wrong word, but there's a greater respect for Buddy's situation than there may be for Ben's, because the game isn't being affected, so in very simple terms.
May I be devil's advocate on that?
Yeah, go.
I think that Buddy is very much at risk of things turning on him in a negative way, because at the end of the day, his story is one which is a blend of privacy and inviting attention, and it's not just the question of, you could end up getting a massive deal like the way he did to go to the Swans, but otherwise be an exceptionally private person, whereas there's a fair bit of bling about Buddy and the way that he lives his life and where he might be photographed at the polo and, so forth.
The Bondi billionaires, I think they call them.
And so I think that he's presently treading that really fine line. I'm surprised already that social media hasn't leaked what the condition actually is, and I can draw a line and say, in terms of if we can predict where the future might go, different context, but over in the UK, you had Ryan Giggs, who's now touted to potentially be the next manager at Man U. So Premier League footballer, very famous, well known. Anyway, he, amongst a number of others, back a few years ago, they were doing things, getting what are called super injunctions over in the UK courts. And super injunctions, and they've got slightly different laws there than here, which allow them to do this. They have this human rights law, which they are exploiting in order to say, I've been having an affair. In this Ryan Giggs case, he was having an affair with his brother's wife which we had done for 8 years. And then at the same time, he was shagging somebody else and he was married. But he managed to get these super injunctions, as a lot of stars did, to stop reporting not only of the proceedings, or of the content of the proceedings, but of the proceedings itself. And it was Twitter that leaked it. And Twitter then went berserk about a whole lot of other people, and now you're not going to see super injunctions anymore in the UK. I think there's been like one in the last couple of years because just the tide turned. And I think there's a huge risk that that's going to happen with Buddy, and no matter what the condition is, I think that he should control getting that story out really soon.
And that just quickly, that raises a point about Twitter, is that the way that technology is proliferating at the moment, and you can take magnificent photographs with your phone, the intrusion on privacy is going to just go through the roof, because essentially, unless you're in the middle of a rainforest with no one around you, there will be someone with a smartphone who will get a photograph of you doing something that you don't want people to know about. And that's a massive challenge for the law, I imagine.
And this has already occurred with Franklin, because I think it was 2 days ago, the Daily Mail photographed Franklin going into Swan's headquarters. And of course there are rumours linking him to other women in this report. What's happened is, because Buddy's not saying anything, he's leaving it open to the field for people to speculate. And the thing about Franklin is, he's not just a footballer. He's a $10 million clothing brand. And part of I reckon Buddy's reason for going to Bondi was it's far more marketable than going to Blacktown, because when you've got Nina and Pasadena, you want to be seen as being part chic, part grunge, and Buddy does that brilliantly. He's far shrewder than we give him credit for, but by saying nothing, he's leaving it open to speculation.
Okay, so control of image is really important, and Natalie mentioned quite an interesting photo of Nat 5, which was published about a week or two ago after the Brownlow, I think. And in fact, the next morning, where he's kind of posing without a top, with a Apple gizmo on his wrist, and wearing particular clothing. Obviously a set-up kind of image. Now, hadn't that been orchestrated, what would the result have been, do you think?
Well, I think he looked a little bit too satisfied with himself to be anything other than orchestrated. But I think that when we think of breach of confidence as a legal cause of action, which is kind of all we've got in Australia, if it's in the bedroom and someone's taken a photograph clearly through nefarious means, then I think you would have a really good case. And really, breach of confidence is so simple, you don't have to be a lawyer to get it. If it's in circumstances where you think that it's a confidential environment, then that will be regarded as breach of confidence. It's kind of as simple as that. But of course, that leads us back to the very beginning question that we had, which is what are the circumstances that might lend itself to that particular environment?
The image can run out of control very, very quickly. Just on a sort of a lighter note, I had a situation when I left the Western Bulldogs and I was going to try to coach the Sydney Swans. All hell broke loose over about a week, and because I was in contract and had left the Bulldogs fans were completely up in arms. Now, I'm now just doing what I'm doing in my general life. I go to a basketball game, a junior basketball game with my kids, and not thinking, but I'm wearing a red and white top, just a pair of jeans and a red and white top. There happens to be a photographer that comes along, unbeknownst to me, takes a photo of me at the basketball, just watching my kids run up and down the basketball court, plastered in the paper in the Sunday papers that day, and all hell broke loose talk about image, that I was flying it in the face of the Western Bulldogs fans by wearing a red and white top I didn't even know was going to be in the paper. So it can actually get out of control without you even wanting it to be that way.
Absolutely.
And just on the Fife image question, that's a good example. And I think one of the things that we've found recently is that you can't even be sure when a breach is claimed that a breach has actually occurred. So I don't know how many of you remember, but Lara Bingle claimed that she was photographed from a great distance, topless or something, or in the shower. It turns out that she had organised a photographer to take those photos of her, and then she confected this outrage about what had happened to her. Similarly, Scarlett Johansson had some compromising photos which were supposedly private, which were leaked, and she wanted to find out who'd done it and everything. She actually leaked it. So when you have a discerning and intelligent audience, people will have a level of cynicism now about whether these breaches are actual breaches or not, or publicity stunts.
Yeah, indeed. So, how finding the line, I think very much depends on individual context, how willing that person is to be involved in a breach of their own privacy, which I guess with smartphones and the notion when I started journalism back in the mid-70s that people would be putting semi-clad photos up available for everyone to see, and let alone some of the other stuff, was inconceivable and unthinkable. But so the whole concept of privacy seems to have changed, but not necessarily the law, right?
No. The law's capable of adapting to new circumstances, so that breach of confidence law exists. But I as a litigator, I take the view that you always have to assess what your evidence is going to look like, and I think where it's all over the shop, you can actually start distilling it down and sort of say to yourself, whose behaviour is really consistent? So if you've got someone who is consistent in the way that they behave in terms of always being outside the public eye, footballers, for the AFL enthusiasts, might be a Dustin Fletcher or a Maddie Scarlett or some of these guys who are fabulous on the football field but very quiet away from it. Those are the examples where if something happened which was genuinely, it seems really at odds and they're really upset about it, then that's where you can say, I reckon that's a good case. Let's take that one on. But if a person's behaviour has been genuinely inconsistent or hypocritical, and judges hate hypocrites, we look at Tiger Woods and what happened with Tiger Woods, in terms of a gazillion affairs, and then over here a gazillion dollars in endorsement deals. That's one where the concept of hypocrisy, even if you've got a case, you'll be so worried about the way a judge will deal with it that you'll just say, don't take it on, don't sue.
And this is probably too broad for this discussion, but I look at things like Big Brother, and I also look at the activities of my daughters on Instagram and Twitter, and their standard of what constitutes a breach of privacy is about 30,000 leagues below mine. So they say, well, what's the big deal? On Big Brother, you see someone going to the toilet, that's fine. Well, it's changing, and I don't think the law... Obviously, it's a cliche to say that the law hasn't changed with it, but that's something that needs to be
Sports
considered.
people were very slow on the uptake, I think, with social media. What people were sort of writing to each other, they thought was private. And just crazy. The amount of work that's had to be done around AFL clubs to let people know that whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, if I'm writing a conversation to you, it might as well be on the back page of the Herald Sun.
It will be. It will be.
Exactly. But I really do believe that a lot of sports people are really slow on the uptake with that.
We'll take questions in a minute. I just finally, women's football is becoming more popular, and quite rightly, I think. Is there concern about the way media might in future, say in 5 years when it's a little more, gets more coverage, report the activities of women footballers?
Can we talk about it now?
Sure.
Seriously, Graham Corns over in South Australia a few weeks ago, the way he was basically advocating for a lingerie league and saying, and he came right out and said that he'd watched it was a huge ratings success, this Australian women's football AFL game, and he said that it was basically freak ratings. It did better than, at least, admittedly not the top AFL teams, but some of the bottom AFL teams, so they were comparing the ratings figures. And he then criticised the clothing that the women were wearing, saying it wasn't flattering enough. I'm pleased to say that he was slammed on social media for that. But I think that it's an interesting, and look, he's fairly unreconstructed, but I'm sure a lovely guy. But you know, guys are entitled to their views about these sorts of things, but can be a bit of a shock to the system when something comes on board that's actually capable of creating ratings and what that might look like. And it can cause mouths to talk before the brains have really processed the issues. So I think that there is a really interesting issue about how that's going to play itself out in the immediate future, let alone the long term.
Well, we have plans to cover women's football because that's a really important plank in the AFL's development of the game. And my approach, without having actually thought too hard about it, is that we would cover it in exactly the same way as we'd cover the elite game. And I think if you come in with higher standards, if you like, of photography in the rooms or whatever, then you're leaving yourself open to a very legitimate claim of sexism. So I think you just cover it like you cover the elite game.
The one thing that I would say about it is that the education process, what I was just talking about with sports people in general and social media, if all of a sudden we're going to profile these girls, and I've done a lot of work with the women's football, we've got to educate them as well about what they're putting on their own social media sites, because we don't want them to come straight in and all of a sudden there's issues around that straight away because they've put things on that perhaps they thought was going to be acceptable that perhaps isn't. So the education process needs to be come along with it.
Hi. In regards to is it Kim Duthie, the schoolgirl? How should the media be treating people that are under the age of 18 or kids at school when it comes to their interaction with these public personalities?
Well, that's a really good question. So from my point of view, and the others will have their views of it, she was a very vulnerable and slightly damaged young girl who was trashed in the media, while the players who were involved with her, who should have known better and were adults, were protected by the superstructure of their club. So I was at the Herald Sun when a lot of that was happening, and we had an editor, Jill Baker, who was editing the Sunday version of the paper, and she made the call, which I think was a great one, was that we refer this girl to welfare and help and get her assistance and just leave the story alone, because she was getting to the point where she was a risk to herself. But the interesting thing about that was that she was pushing herself into the media, so she was constantly going to journalists and saying, you know, I've got another story about Nick Rewalt and all of this sort of thing, which for a journalist is a pretty tempting offer. But there was a real level of maturity, I think, at the newspaper to say that, you know, this girl's at risk, so we're not going to deal with her, or we're going to send her into welfare.
Can I ask a question, which is sort of taking on board that, and let's say it's a male, like Daniel Chick, like in the last couple of weeks, coming out, and it was obvious that story was in the pipeline for quite a long time about what his drug issues, or what his version of this particular story, that the timing of the publication of that was interesting in terms of Grand Final week. I've just been a bit perplexed and interested about that. So, Matt, Tom, I was interested in your views.
You have a crack, Tom.
Well, the Chick story was quite staggering. Well, firstly on it, it staggers me that a club doesn't know that there's a culture of drug taking. It just beggars belief. And that a coach would say, are you taking drugs? And a guy would say no, and that's it. When you've got the Vegas trip in which one player apparently was near death, you've got real questions about the culture of a club. And this I think is what private lives give us. They delve in to show that the simple act reflects a culture in which this act takes place. And it shows whether that culture is good or bad. At this club, it would seem the culture was so bad that you've got one player, past player, who's since passed on because of drug taking. It really raises some huge moral questions about that club.
Do we think that part of the problem is simply just the matter of the number of journalists that are currently covering footy at the moment? Ultimately there's a finite amount of stories that are out there, and there seems to be an infinite amount of journalists, and I just wonder whether we are perhaps heading down the path of like the Premier League and then all the reporting that happens in the UK where a lot of it becomes fabricated, and are we at risk of heading the same way?
What's the numbers that cover AFL football in comparison to what that cover Australian politics? It's far outweighs the AFL footy, far outweighs Australian politics, federal politics.
I think the four are in that back room just then, Terry.
And they're following the money. So the impetus for more and more football coverage is the fact that football sells newspapers and sells clicks on websites, and that's why these businesses do it, because they know that it's going to bring them a return. So football is probably the single most important topic for the Herald Sun in Melbourne, and that's the pressure there. And you have to, as a journalist, if you're going to be successful, you have to find stories that other people don't have. So it's all very easy to do the hamstrings and the ankles, but if you want to become a well-regarded football journalist, you have to go down there's a pressure to go down this path to get stories which are different.
There is enormous pressures in that part of the industry. I mentioned before about people having left the industry to go to other parts of the industry because of the pressures that are applied. I'll give you one very quick example. I had, as a player, I had my face smashed in at one stage. I was working at Channel 9 at the time, and their head journalist at the time, I was working there as for Sky Channel, which was part of the Nine network, but not intrinsically locked in with it. I had the head journalist at Channel 9 tell me that he was going to go to the bosses of Channel 9 if I didn't allow him to do an interview with me. I had like 80 stitches in my face, had reconstructive surgery, and he was going to get me taken out of my job if I didn't give him an interview, which I didn't feel inclined to do because I didn't think it was good for kids to be sort of seeing that. I sort of thought there was a responsibility to mums and families not to be showing that sort of thing. But such was the pressure on him from his bosses that he started threatening me about my job. So there's enormous pressures, deadlines and pressures, enormous.
Hopefully his bosses would have sacked him if he'd done that.
Well, he did do that, and he is in almost the highest of positions at Channel 9 still.
Right.
Just in terms of reporting on the drug taking, is there a way that you approach it that, because I think there is a fine line between reporting it to say that it's bad, and then sometimes it can be conveyed as sort of endorsing drug taking when they're such great players. And I think this happened with the Ben Cousins when the documentary came out, and it sort of encouraged that sort of behaviour. So how do you approach it to sort of discourage that behaviour? And do you think there needs to be more restrictions on the players? It's
a really interesting question, because if the media was in the business of societal change, they would take a completely different approach to these sort of issues. So there's one thing where the media generally agrees to be restrained, and that's in the reporting of suicide. So there's a clear link between reportage of suicide and increases in subsequent suicide. So media has agreed informally that they won't report suicides, but now there's a code. You go down to the bottom of the story and it's got in italics, if you're suffering mental problems, go to Beyond Blue. So that, we need to come up with a different way of handling that. But from a drug perspective, we're not in that position at the moment where there's a belief that the reportage of this will encourage kids to take drugs, and I don't know whether there's any evidence of that occurring, but certainly Ben Cousins was an incredibly glamorous man, and his lifestyle looked pretty great until it all fell apart. Harley Bennell, another one, beautifully gifted, wonderful footballer, seen on the front page of the Herald Sun or News Limited papers snorting cocaine. So we're a long way from chasing the money, if you like, on those stories and coming up with a more responsible approach to that sort of reportage.
If I could just add a little bit, I was part of that documentary, so it was really interesting that we at the Richmond Football Club gave Ben Cousins the opportunity because we were the last team, and it was virtually the last cab off the rank. We were the last team, and I can remember having a discussion. It was a football discussion, but it was a life discussion as well, and I can remember having a discussion with our board and saying, could we live with ourselves if in 2 months' time, 3 months' time, we have the opportunity of giving this young man who had done a lot for the industry a chance, his last chance to get back in, and if we don't give him that opportunity to try to straighten himself out, and then the news comes through that he ends up passing away, could we live it with ourselves by not giving him that opportunity? We gave him that chance. It hasn't worked out for him, but we thought we had done the right thing. In regards to the documentary, I was a part of the documentary. I must say, after the aftermath of it, and looking back on it, I sat back now and sort of went, was it glorifying it? And I had a sense a little bit that it was, and that people sort of saw that he was almost bulletproof, and, you know, did it sort of open up the opportunity. So I must say, in hindsight, and it's only hindsight sometimes when you do it, you were doing it for all the right reasons at the time, but I'm not sure whether it ended up being the right reasons.
Tom?
Yeah, on drug take, I think there's one thing that really isn't investigated properly, and that's the link between the drug taking to organised crime. We saw it in Colombian football, where organised crime just took over the whole industry. The links of certain players to bikie gangs, certain players being members of bikie gangs on retirement, the links in the Essendon peptide saga of certain individuals to criminal figures. You only have to go on to Google Images to pick these things up. And the fact that a fitness advisor has served time. This is the area that needs to be investigated more by journalists. The Essendon peptide saga leads into this.
Okay, I think we could certainly go on, but we have run out of time. So I'd like you to thank Terry, Matt, Natalie and Tom. Thank you very much.